What's up, everyone? Welcome. We are live right now in the CannaBuzz community. And if you're watching us on YouTube, thank you for joining us. Please like the video and make sure to subscribe to the channel. We have tons of great videos on this channel and more on the way, just like this one today. We're going to be talking all about compost with our guest today, Mark Sturges. But before we get into that, before we get too deep into all the compost knowledge, JR has a ton of great questions ready for us today. But before we get into that, I've got to do a couple shout outs first. First off, shout out to our friends in the CannaBuzz community. They're watching us live right now, like I said, on our live stream, and they can join us in chat. We do giveaways every single interview. We give away packs of seeds and all kinds of stuff. So join us in our CannaBuzz community by searching CannaBuzz in the App Store, or go to cannabuzz.app in your browser and use the code GROWERSLOVE for 50% off your first month in the community. We really appreciate your support. It helps us keep going on. It's kind of like a Patreon plus a community, so please join us over there. And then also, we need to give a shout out to our main sponsor, TikiMadMan, over at tikiseeds.com. He always hooks us up with the latest and greatest shout outs. He's got a 20% off summer sale right now off the entire site. Is that right, JR?
Yeah, and he also did a really cool event down in Arizona, which I'm excited to hear about. So if you're in the Phoenix, Arizona area, there should be some TikiMadMan stuff around. So check that out.
Awesome. So yeah, make sure to check out and support Tiki. We really appreciate his support. And then if you like my hat, go to shop.cannabuzz.app, grab yourself a hat. But all right, enough shout outs. Let's get into our great guest today. His name is Mark Sturges. And JR, let's get into the intro. You got a great intro for us.
Yeah, Mark Sturges is a Southern Oregon farmer. He's been around for years, and he's really specializes in compost. And his compost is a very, very diverse compost. He's traveled the world. He has a wealth of knowledge. He's well respected among his peers. Elaine has often said that his compost has the greatest biodiversity that she's seen, and so that's something to be touted about as well. And we had the pleasure of meeting Mark at the Dew Grows Cup there in Colorado, and I got a chance to feel the man's compost, and it was silky smooth and just gorgeous. So I'm really excited to have him on to kind of walk us through that. Let us know what composting is all about, and maybe some of the beneficial guys that we want to keep around and not destroy. So welcome to the show, Mark. Glad to have you.
Well, it's great to be here, JR and Sam.
Yeah, it's good to see you. I got to talk to you a little bit as well at the Dew Grows Cup. When you popped on, I put the face to a name, so I'm excited to hang out with you today and talk about compost. But before we get into the compost, what we like to start our interviews off with is a kind of question about you, how you got started, and maybe fell in love with cannabis. And then also, maybe how did you fall in love with compost? Maybe that's another good question, too.
Well, the first two things, I've been into cannabis for a long time. I think, I first smoked cannabis like, maybe 68 or 69. Smoked my first real bud that wasn't dirt weed in the Army at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, in 1970. And so I've been into cannabis for a long time. I really got inspired during my early writing career. I had a good buddy, and we were really into hash, and so it was really exciting. I remember the first rejection I ever got for one of my books. My buddy was going by and in downtown Ashland, and he brought out his bag and his hash, and we were we were smoking over a cement wall down kind of an enclosed area, and I didn't care if I was rejected or not, and so then I went to India to work on my master's degree, and I went from Greece overland on a magic bus to India, and spent quite a bit of time in the hash growing areas of India, which got me even more inspired. But then when I came home, it wasn't that. It was a couple of years after that it was in the '80s, and I went to work for in the fine wine industry, and we had random testing. So then I didn't smoke for 25 years until I got out of the corporate America.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
then
it sucks to be in that trap.
yeah, I hear you. And how does where does compost come in there? When did you start kind of like specializing or diving into compost?
Well, I'm a farm kid. I grew up in Sacramento, and some of our soils on our ranch and our farm were still some of the greatest soils I've ever seen. And so I've always been, just totally into soil. My dad was a big leaf mold guy, and then it was about in the late '90s. I was going through Ashland, and a buddy of mine said, "Hey, come look at my soil." And so I go, "Okay." So he gave me these worms, and I went home and I just threw them in my compost pile. And so then I was at his place again about 3 minutes later, and say, "Hey, come look at my ecosystem bin." Now you can call it ecosystem bin, but anyway, I go, "Geez, I got to have that." And then within about 3 or 4 months, being kind of the obsessive guy I had like 6 2 by 4 by 8 foot bins of compost, and then I kind of ran into to Ingham, and she said, "Well, this is pretty amazing stuff." And since then, it's just been, I've been totally into it.
Awesome.
Well, good. Let's get into it. I think people are going to get some good knowledge today. I think we're going to try to chug along with this as fast as we can because we've really got a lot to cover. So I'll kind of fire it off with what are some of the main benefits that a plant or vegetables, cannabis are going to receive from getting really good quality compost?
Well, what they're going to receive is the diversity and and all these different creatures. Like I used to teach a lot of soil, a lot of pasture restoration, and so I used to always teach in those days that it takes because we were really into cattle and dung beetles, and so I said, well, it takes zillions of small creatures to raise a few big ones, and so therefore, just all these small creatures from fungus to bacteria, all these soil creatures, they're always they're mitigating, bringing up every mineral and that your plants need. They're bringing that, they're eating that and processing it and making it available to the plants, where without those creatures, it wouldn't be available to the plants and the roots.
Nice. Excellent.
All right, so this next question is something I guess it's been on our mind, a lot of people's minds, especially this summer with how hot it's been lately. It's the topic of climate change. So how does compost fit into that equation? How can compost help us in that way?
Well, once again, we'll go back to cattle ranching, and I had I had a good friend in Texas named Betsy Ross, and I think she's still ranching down there. I haven't talked to her for a few years, but she noticed that using compost and compost tea on her pastures, um, they lasted a lot longer, and the cows kept grazing when it was so hot that everybody else's cows would be seeking out shade, but they were still grazing because the ambient temperature was a couple degrees cooler.
Huh.
Yeah, I just
Interesting.
actually put out a little article about that. The guy was out in what he called what was healthy grasslands, and he showed that there was like a 20 degree difference down below in the lower part of the soil versus this other, human grass that we throw out, monocropped grass, where the reflective temperature was like up into the 120 degrees. So the swing in temperature differences between a healthy natural grass compared to like a monoculture or monocrop grass is completely different. So when we're starting to get our minds started into the composting arena, what are the things we should be composting, and what are maybe some of the things we should avoid?
Well, you definitely want to be composting food matter, uh, vegetable food matter, and not definitely you don't want to be doing meat. Um, there's different things like you can, if you're static piling outside and you got your compost really hot, you can put animals in that. I used to know a guy that used to he used to put pigs in his compost pile to cook them, and so in Hawaii, I was over teaching over there, and a friend, he was teaching at in Maui at the college there, and they have a big deer problem. They're called Atlas deer, and so these farmers were shooting, I don't know, 40 or 50 a night, and taking them to William, and so they were on the campus there. They were getting these big piles of wood chips, and so they were composting these deer, and it made great compost, but it ran out after about 30 days. It wasn't viable anymore. But for the home composter, you're probably not going to be dealing with that, and so you're not going to be wanting to deal with it with any animals. You're wanting to be just vegetable matter, and there's a couple different. If you're doing the static pile, you can use straw and leaves and stuff like that, and it's great compost. And static piles are really, really important. I got static piles that out in my orchard that when I was static pile, I go, okay, I'm looking at next year. But in containerized composting and ecosystem bins, you don't want to use straw, or you don't want to use leaves or grass clippings, because they just won't break down. The creatures in there just aren't going to eat them. So it just takes way too long.
Huh, interesting. So, with that kind of gets us into our next topic, which was going to be about the differences between indoor and outdoor composting. So, are there things that folks should keep in mind if they're trying to compost in their apartment or their house or whatever the situation is versus, me having something outside?
Well, once again, that's the question is if you're composting inside, in a little bin under your sink,
Yeah.
you treat that as if you were containerized composting. So you wouldn't want to put any leaves or straw in there. So you're going to just be doing food scraps. And if you but you want to I'd say start out with some good ecosystem compost inoculant, so that if you have fruit flies or anything like that, your creatures are going to eat them. And so you don't want to put anything in that compost that isn't like, if you're gonna put like a scoop or two of well rotted manure in there, well, that's fine if it's well rotted, but you don't want to put anything in there that's going to be offensive to like your wife or other people that are
Yeah.
going to discourage you from composting.
Right. What about anything citrusy? Like if I eat an orange or something like that, can I throw like orange peels in a compost?
I was taught a long time ago that you weren't supposed to, but I've been throwing stuff in there for 20 years and I have no problem.
Yeah.
But maybe inside, just experiment with it, see what happens. But
Yeah.
when you're decomposing like orange rinds and stuff like that, it's pretty powdery, and so you might not want to do that under your sink.
Okay.
But outside, go ahead.
No, that's very good. That's very good information, because I think that I was reading that article. I may have mentioned it before, that like South Korea has cleaned up their food waste from a 90% food waste to down to under 5% food waste. And they've increased their amount of available fertilizer by quite a bit. And they have limitations on the availability for fertilizer. For all these years, they had just been throwing it into, landfills and dump situations. So now I think if people start, I mean, we even have, like, here in Portland metro area, they have municipalities that are actually implementing composting programs.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk a little bit about maybe some of the programs like that are going on, and what you would maybe want to, watch out if you are getting compost from those situations?
Well, the one thing I'd watch out for, that's been a major problem. I haven't heard about it lately, but a lot of people were going to these facilities, and they were using a lot of grass clippings.
Yeah.
And so the grass, a lot of some cities, Portland, I heard it was happening in Seattle. I never heard about Portland, but they were still using cropolid on their lawns, and so it was killing their compost.
Oh, all the
Yeah.
microbial life was getting destroyed.
Right. And it's just like and that's that. Well, one other thing I'd like to say, maybe it isn't as big a problem because all the newspapers are dying, but master gardeners used to always teach, oh yeah, put a shredded newspaper in your worm bins.
Yeah.
Well, to me, that just makes a sloggy mess. And so I've gotten some big battles with master gardeners about this. I said, you don't want to do that because you're just creating a big mess by doing that.
I have another question for you on the municipal compost thing, because it's something that I've kind of, it's been tempting for me. I live in Northern California near Napa. So Napa's Napa and the county where I live, I think that, or my area, they kind of put all their green bin stuff together, and then you can I can fill a truck bed full of compost for like $15, which is really tempting, if you're filling up your whole backyard or whatever. But I noticed that couple things that I noticed. One, when I drove by, I noticed that there was like plastic and things like that in the compost. You know, because like anyone can throw anything in a green bin. It's not like they're necessarily really sorting that stuff. So there could be all kinds of trash or whatever in there. But my question for you was about how they process this compost. I noticed that they basically dump all this green bin stuff into giant piles, and they put it on this like concrete floor that has like holes in it, and they quick compost it in like a 2 week period of time or something like that. Can you like is that really quality? It just seems like they're somehow cooking it really quickly and then churning it out.
Well, I'd agree with you there. It's being cooked too fast. And one thing that I've, been writing for Acres for 20 years, and what we've always taught is know your farmer, know your rancher. It's just like going to the farmer's market. You can get to know these people and know what they're doing, but you don't know what you're getting when you get bulk stuff like this. You have no idea. And through the years, I've discovered is once you get some bad stuff, it's hard to remediate it. When early on in my ecosystem career, I had a buddy that said, "Hey, I got this great rabbit shit connection," and so I drove over. It was in Gold Hill, and this guy was the biggest rabbit producer one of the biggest on the West Coast. And so I didn't drive over there once. I went over there twice with my 3/4 ton pickup, and came and dumped all this this rabbit shit in my bins. And in those days, I had these 2x4x8 plywood bins, and I'd have like a third of it was new manure, a third was medium, and a third was finishing stuff. And as soon as I put that in there, all the creatures started fleeing.
Oh
They
no.
wanted out. Yeah. And so I tried everything that I knew of to fix this. And I used biodynamic preps. I used everything. But after about 2 years, I shoveled it all out and put it in a pile out in the orchard and just let the rain leach it for 2 years.
Wow.
So if you get some toxic stuff from like one of these municipal places, it's hard to remediate it.
Yeah.
So the long-term damage can actually be something that even happens over time. Like you're losing all the good guys and all the bad guys are winning, kind of thing.
Correct.
So with composting, they talk a lot about composting with carbon to nitrogen ratios. Can you kind of talk about some good carbon sources and some good nitrogen sources?
Well, yes. I'm kind of like I build my static piles out of organic straw, and then manure, and then green waste. Like all the weeds I pull. When I see a weed, I think of soil, and so I don't mind weeds, and so I'll put that on there. All my prunings from my apple trees and my kiwis. Generally, I'll lay that on the very bottom, and then the straw, and then the manure, and then the green stuff, like the weeds or what have you. But once again, talking about your manure sources, it's been really important to know your rancher or your farmer, because there's lots of horse manure. Horses produce in like 20 pounds of manure a day. And
Jesus.
so people love you if you'll come and get their horse manure from them. But you have to teach these horse people about not deworming their horses, or deworming, because that's what killed all their dung beetles for the last 50 or 60 years. That's what we're finally getting dung beetles back in this country, because we've talked these ranchers into stopping deworming. And so when you tell these you say, well, I'd love to take your horse manure, but you've been worming and I can't use it. And so because deworming is another thing that'll just kill all your biology. And one of the we had a great naturalist up in Nebraska named George Wagner. I think he's gone now, but he did this. He was a great photographer, and he had these big herds of goats. And so he would, when these goats would drop their manure, whether there might have been a few cows, he would take pictures of these manure piles, and within I don't know, I think it was 8 hours, these dung beetles were flying in, and there would just be these horrible tapeworms and roundworms, and all these worms from these goats would be in these dung piles. But when they were unwormed goats or unwormed cows, that the dung beetles would come, and they would get rid of all the manure. And so after 2 to 3 days, the only thing you would have would be these parasites on top of the ground that couldn't live in that kind of environment. And so it was just unbelievable that this was happening. So when you think that's happening within 3 days, when you think of the opposite way, when most of the people are still worming even their cows and their horses and their goats, the opposite happens. And in 20 minutes, when these dung beetles fly in, they're killed, and so nothing happens except the flies. And so then all these animals are tracking through these manure piles, and they're the cycle is continuing of all these horrible parasites in the animals.
Interesting. What's up, everyone? Just jumping in real quick to give a shout out to one of our sponsors, Terploc, the makers of Grove bags. You can grab a Grove bag in all sorts of sizes. They make small bags in like 8 sizes. You can even get them for your weed brand if you wanted to. And then you can get them all the way up to like giant trash bag liners. So these things can be big and small, all shapes and sizes. This is a 1/4 pound bag right here, and all you do is dry your weed, say in your grow tent or something like that. Dry the weed for about 10 days, 14 days, then stick it in a Grove bag, seal it up, and leave it be. You don't have to worry about burping or any of that stuff. You can get rid of your jars. This is going to cure it. It's going to off gas, do all the things that you need to do. All you need to do after you throw it in the bag and cure it is open it up and smoke it and enjoy it. So go to grovebags.com, use the code CannaBuzz for 7% off your next order. We really appreciate it. Thanks to Grove Bags for their support. Let's get back to the interview. Well, let's talk about carbon to nitrogen ratios. So I've read that there's a ratio of the carbon to nitrogen ratio. There's like an ideal ratio of like 30-1, where 30 parts nitrogen to 1 part, 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Can you talk about this kind of carbon to nitrogen ratio and kind of how that works together?
Well, basically, I just do in my static compost piles, I just do a third, a third, a third, and I don't worry about it. And then, you know, here in the Pacific Northwest, where it's a lot wetter, we cover our piles because, you know, the rain's going to leach all this stuff out. And I'm also a believer that you don't want to turn your static piles a whole bunch, because then you're releasing the nitrogen into the air instead of keeping it. And so a long time ago, I was at Steiner College, and I was talking to him about, you know, well, you can have plantable compost in 3 days, and I mean in 3 weeks, excuse me. But he had these long compost windrows, and he said, Mark, I don't have time to turn, but I have time to wait. And so that was a great lesson I learned. And so that's kind of, I've stayed to that style. Like when I'm doing I think I mentioned this earlier, but when I'm doing my compost piles, those are for next year. It's always residual. You're always building for the future. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
no, that's good. I do have a follow-up question based on what you were talking about earlier. You were talking about kind of inoculating the compost bin, it sounds like, almost with manure from some sort of animal. I was curious if I could, instead of like you know, horse manure or something like that, could I use vermicompost at all? Is that a decent substitute?
well, my problem with vermicompost, because I have as many worms as anybody, but when you're thinking about worms all the time, you're becoming a monoculturist, and you're not thinking about all these other creatures. So when you're first starting out, you want to inoculate with worms. You want to put some worms in your compost, but vermicompost, you're making vermicompost. So once you've inoculated, then, you know, you probably aren't going to want it. And some of the good manure you're bringing in, it's going to be alive as well.
Yeah.
And in what I've seen through the years is worms get all the credit, but you know, when you have all these other creatures, when you're out in the pastures, you see the beetles, you see everybody. The worms are the last people to show up.
What I have a ton of in my yard is the little roly-poly guys.
Right.
So I have a ton of those on the top layer, and then maybe below the mulch layers where the worms are. And so I'm just noticing that there's like all these different interactions, like you're saying. There's not just worms that are, you know, helping break all this stuff down.
Well, the sow bugs, I have a lot of them too, and most of the time, sow bugs in the bins, they don't eat composting stuff. They'll eat, like, you know, if it's potato sprouts, they'll like kind of chomp on that. But a long time ago, I had the idea that I was gonna, because sow bugs are in the same family as crustaceans, of crabs and stuff. So I thought, well, maybe they'd be a good chitin source.
Yeah.
And so when that was known that I was looking for these sow bugs, everybody started sending me these these sites, like sow bugs live for 5 years and stuff like that. But I never found a way to grind them up or anything. So I basically just leave them alone.
Yeah,
I heard that what I heard about sow bugs is they're beneficial until they run out of something to eat.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Once they,
they're tough on seedlings
Yeah,
yeah.
that's true. Yeah, that is very true. I've
until
noticed
the
that with other plants.
seedlings get up like 3 or 4 inches, then they don't bother them.
Totally. Yeah, I've noticed that to we can move on to this next subject, but I'll just echo what you both were just saying because I have experienced that with my own yard where the those bugs will kind of attack my plants towards the bottom of it, especially if they're really small, but once your plant gets big enough, it's usually not an issue, but you kind of do have to watch out for them here and there. But let's get into the next question about compost. JR, it was about moisture levels, right?
Yeah, because like you said, you tarp yours here in the Northwest. But say I live in Phoenix, Arizona. How am I going to be making sure that I'm composting with the right kind of moisture levels? Is there like meters or go by feel, or is there a
Yeah,
Jedi?
you want to go by feel. And the way I teach that is because a certain person, won't name names, but they used to always tell me my compost was way too wet. But how you saw my compost at the DGC cup, that's how wet I want it, because the your moisture levels have to be up, because the lower the moisture level, the more creatures you lose when it starts to dry up.
Yeah. And so,
And
and so
so
that's a,
in Phoenix or Tucson, if you're composting there, it's going to be tough, but you're gonna have to put some water on it.
Yeah, and
so if,
how do you kind of manage that dance, I guess? Because it just reminds me of watering, plant watering. You know, I'm learning, you know, with my different plants how much I water them, especially when it gets really hot out. You know, sometimes I water it too much because I'm trying to overcompensate. I'm sure the same thing could happen with my compost pile. So how do I kind of like monitor that or do that dance?
Yeah, well, see, that's the thing when you're compost. I sent some bud to the DGC cup in my compost, and when I opened it up I opened it up, like, on Saturday, and this had been from last year's harvest, and I was amazed because this bud that was in the bottom, in the midst of that compost, it was moist. There was no it wasn't like when I sent it. So that's another thing about using compost. Or so when you look at your compost, you can tell if it's dry, it's going to be dry. So but the problem is in Phoenix or Tucson is water is so expensive.
yeah.
So anything you can do to find shade for it, that's going to be a bonus.
Yeah.
Well, if you got AC in the house, maybe you can convince your wife into letting you have a compost bedroom.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
So, so really, at the end of the day, you had mentioned like you plan for the year ahead of when you're going to use your compost, and you're staging constantly. But in your mind, how do you know when it's ready, other than looking under a microscope? And maybe you talk about what you might see if you did look under a microscope.
Well, first of all, I think that everybody should have a little compost bin, and everybody should have a microscope. Because when you look under the microscope, you're seeing when you're looking at healthy compost, especially ecosystem compost, you're seeing all kinds of creatures. I mean, it's like going to the movies. And you're seeing nematodes, you're seeing rotifers, you're seeing all these things. And so And what was, sorry, what was the question again?
I think we were. I'm as stunned as you are, Mark. I know. I think we were. What were we talking
You
about,
were
Jim?
asking about when you know the compost is ready. So like
Oh,
you
okay.
start it, you know, like a
Okay.
year ahead of time or whatever. But when
Okay.
can I
Well,
use it?
oh, well, the important thing is when you, let's go to ecosystem containerized composting.
Yeah.
When I'm throwing this stuff in my bins. And so when you can't recognize the vegetables anymore, you know, the avocados, um, the beets, the watermelons, the pumpkins, when you can't recognize it anymore, chances are it's going to be ready. When you're static composting outside, it's going to be a lot longer, and so you know, it's just going to take you longer.
Well, let's I
And
have so
yeah, go ahead.
we have a couple questions. The next one was going to be about you know, common pests in your compost bin, but I'm going to throw a new question in right before that one, which is because I would just love to get your tips on building a compost bin, because these are some of the details that like psych me out, because I'm like, how big does it need to be? Does it need to have like fencing or mesh on the side or whatever? Like I just kind of get in my own head and I get psyched out, and then I don't have a compost pile. You know what I mean? So I'm like, so what's a good, just kind of some easy tips for someone that someone could do in their backyard?
Okay, well, the best tip, you know, I'm simple. I try to do everything as simply as I can so I can understand it. But the pitchfork is the foundation of my empire. And the other thing about building a compost bin, well, you start out with, you know, with a little plastic tote that you could get at Mart or wherever, Office Depot, and just, you know, cut some holes in the sides, and drill some holes in one end so the leachate will run out,
Yeah.
and then just put you know, a lid on it, of course, and then put these little screens to keep the, you know, things out. That's for your inside bin. And for the outside bin, I started out with was taught, we just built 2x4x6 plywood bins. You just take 3 sheets of plywood, and you cut, like, you know, you cut one of them's the bottom, one of them's the top, and then the sides are just cut into 4-foot strips. And then, you know, you just frame it in with 2x2s, screwed together, and you know, drill all these holes, you know, down the sides with a hole saw, and then put these screens on with 5/8 hardware cloth, and so the beetles can fly in, but the rats and stuff can't get in.
Okay.
And so then once you've done that, you're gonna drill some holes down at one end and put it on cinder blocks, and then tilt it up a little so that so all your leachate will run out into a container, and then go to the hardware store, the paint store, and get you can get gallons of mist. Well, you used to be able to. I haven't built any wooden bins for years because I'm using bulk dairy tanks that are stainless steel. But you go and you get this really the cheapest paint you can find, and do like about 3 coats, and do the inside and do the outside, and then just get a couple hinges so that your lid will lift up, and you want to frame your lid too, so it'll be kind of sturdy,
rigid. Yeah, that's
That's
cool.
awesome. I need that. I need that for my backyard.
But
So
if anybody wants to call me, I'd be happy to.
yeah, and also I wanted to ask you about when you have what you feel like is your final compost, a good, rich compost. What's the shelf life like, and what is the best way to store it? Like, say I'm doing it indoors, I have more compost than I can use. What's going to be a good way for me to store it to keep it bioly active?
Well, that's a good question, because years ago I used to sell to abandoned dunes, and so they were taking quite a bit of compost because their tea program was pretty big. And so one day my buddy called me and said, "Hey, Mark, I just found this box of compost in the back of a tractor shed." And so I go, "Well, okay, I'll come look at it." And after 2 years in this cool tractor shed, it was dark and stuff, that compost was still viable. But most of the time, I would recommend, when I getting people started, when I send people inoculant, feed it. Throw some old avocados in there, because you want to keep those creatures alive and eating. So that's the best way to store it.
It's almost like you're treating a living soil, like you're kind of top dressing every so often,
Yeah.
so that you keep everybody happy down in there. Someone in the chat asked about fish bones and fish guts, fish heads, and fish parts. Are those things that are good for your compost pile?
Yeah, those things are good for your compost pile. Like I don't use that much fish stuff because I use organic gem, which is 100% dogfish. So I fish hydrolysate. So, but no, I'd feel great about putting fish heads or whatever in my and one of my neighbors down the street, we talked about this. She puts when she's building her grow bags, she puts a fish in each one at the bottom of the grow bag.
Man.
Yeah, the Mendo Dope Boys from the old Subcool days, TGA, are the ones that taught me about that. They had their big 100-gallon smart pots, and they put a fish head in every pot.
Oh,
yeah.
Maybe I'll learn to fish, and because there's tons of fishing, where I live. Maybe I'll learn to fish. So I also had a question there that I was going to throw in for you, Mark, because we're coming up on the last 10 minutes or so on the interview, and before we move off the topic of compost, I wanted to. So far, you've made it sound way too easy. If your compost is the award-winning stuff, so far you've made it sound way too easy. I want to know the secrets, man. You got to spill the beans, spill the compost, if you will. What are some tricks up your sleeve that you feel like makes your compost better than, the random compost down the street? Obviously it's an attention to detail and attention to quality. I'm sure that's throughout, but I was just kind of curious if anything comes to mind where you feel like, after all these years that you've learned, really does make a difference.
Well, the most important thing is you have to know your rancher, and you have to know what they're doing with their animals. You want to get manure that from people that love and treat their animals great. That's number one. And the same goes with your foodstuffs. You want to be organic as possible. You want to try to get food sources from like your natural foods co-ops or natural food delis. Those are two most important things, are great ingredients in. And that to me, that's the most important thing. And when you're, and like I said, the Pitchforks Foundation, my empire, and for my ecosystem bins is you have to be turning, when you look in your bins and you can't tell if when your argid beetles have just totally decimated your pumpkins and you can't you can't tell what it is anymore, then you want to be turning, because all your creatures, they're lazy like the rest of us. They only want to work like 6 inches down.
Yeah, totally.
And then
Right?
then they just want to hang out in Shangri-La.
Yeah.
And so when you turn it, then because your ecosystem compost can get compacted just like any field. So when you keep turning your compost, then the creatures are down there and they keep working down.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that you don't let your compost get compacted.
That's good. And I think is aeration something you need to be mindful of when you build it in? Or is that, like you said, the tool of the fork?
Yeah, it's a tool of the fork.
Okay. Beauty, eh? So now, Mark, we've got our beautiful, wonderful compost. And I may have even been able to source some from a really good source. How am I going to make my compost tea? And can you just talk about some of the benefits that cannabis is going to receive from a really good, rich compost tea?
Well, what I've been feeding my plants with for years, I feed like every week or every other week, and so what you're doing with with great compost tea, and when I talk about compost or compost tea, I just talk about great stuff. I don't talk about mediocre or some shit that you get from somewhere by the yard. So what you're doing is you're supercharging your soil. You're putting this, like say in a 55-gallon brew, you're using maybe 6 ounces of compost, and you're using 20 ounces of kelp and 20 ounces of malt extract and some humic acid. And that I always use, here's one of my tips, Sam, is in my teas. I was an all grain beer brewer for many years. And so nothing loves to contaminate your brew more than fungus. And so using malt extract instead of molasses, I've always felt that you get many more fungal creatures than if you're using molasses.
Explain why you believe that.
Well, because molasses is a little higher in sugar, and so if you want bacterial teas for grasslands, say, you want a bacterial tea, and so you're adding like like maybe in a 300-gallon application tank, you're adding maybe 10 gallons of molasses, and so all the bacterial loving creatures just swarm it, and so and a long time ago, I took and I took a picture of my compost tea before I was gonna apply it to a cranberry bog. And so I sent the picture to this friend of mine that's he's a math genius. He's a money trader. And I said, can you imagine how many drops of, because it was one drop on a microscope slide of this picture of all these creatures. And I said, can you imagine all the drops that are in a 300-gallon tank? And he goes, yeah, there's 4,386,000 drops. And so when you're thinking that, so that's what's happening when you're putting this tea on, just you're getting all these creatures just instantly, where you couldn't add as much compost as it would take to do that.
Yeah, it's so concentrated.
So does that answer that question?
Yeah, it does.
So can you explain or help me understand the difference between anaerobic and aerobic compost tea? I know sometimes it gets confusing, so I'd love for you to help kind of explain it for folks.
Well, aerobic is what happens when all these creatures have been living their life in air. And so they're doing fine. And that's the problem with a lot of brewers, is they don't have the right amount of oxygen. And so you want to have in a good brew, you want to have a class 4 or a class 5 rapids in your boil. And so if you don't have that, these creatures don't have enough air, and so they're dying. And so when instead of putting live creatures out there, you're putting dead creatures.
Right.
And so you're instead of putting something really alive on your crop, you're putting the Black Lagoon on there. You're putting creatures in the Black Lagoon.
Yeah, that's not good. That's not good at all. So when you were earlier talking about bacterial dominant teas and fungally dominant teas, can you talk about kind of the brewing times and the processes to make sure you have a really strong fungally dominant tea?
Well, for me, I've always been an extended brewer, and so the rotifers, that's kind of how I think how my compost is. And the rotifers are a protozoa that they've discovered are the missing link between smolts and or the small salmon or bass or whatever.
Yeah.
The miss, because they'd get them up to where they say, okay, we can release these, but then they die because they didn't have a food source. But they discovered that the rotifers were the perfect link, that these really tiny fish could just gobble these rotifers. And so the same thing in my compost. There's these rotifers are out there eating bacteria 24 hours a day. And and the great thing about rotifers is they all are encysted with an egg. And so they're out in the bogs or whatever. They're going along, and all of a sudden summer comes and they dry up. And so they sit there until the rains come, and then boom, their egg hatches and they're going again. And so these creatures are doing the same thing for you, is they're just eating all the bacteria in sight. And that's the other important thing about, the difference between growing inside and outside is I don't have any pest issues, because if somebody lands in my plants, I say, oh, there's a mite. There's a spider mite, I think. Oh, a week later, they're gone because a yellow jacket or somebody came along and ate it.
You're on mute there, JR. But yeah, that's an
There's enough
interesting.
of the. Sorry, I had my mute on. I apologize. There's enough of the natural predators to kind of keep things in check but when you're indoors, you may not always have that. And I think a lot of people try to build that into their natural systems now that a lot of people are kind of migrating towards living soil. So now once we've got a really good dominant tea brewed, say we're shooting for a fungally dominant tea, how often and when do we really want to apply that fungally dominant tea to our cannabis?
Well, I was doing some autos in the greenhouse the other day, and I couldn't help myself. I these autos were up about three inches, and I just gave them a dab. I gave them a dab and said, okay, because I experiment. Well, okay, if this kills them, I guess I gave them too much. But or if I have some old, I've had old fish that I wanted to see if it was still any good. And this fish, this organic gem I found it in my shop. It was 5 years old, and I gave him a blast of that, and they did fine. So I feed, like I said, every week, every 2 weeks. The kelp, I don't go real heavy on the kelp. I do that like maybe the kelp I keep my brewer going from because I can from like March to October. So I always have a foundation in my brewer so I can just feed. And so, but like I said, I'll probably feed like 2 or 3 cups of tea for each plant every other week, or every week if I think they need it.
Nice.
But that's the only nutrition they get.
Beauty, eh? That's simple. That's living life simple. So I think Sam has another question for you, and I think we're just about done here.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
one thing I'd like to anybody that wants me to teach them how to build a brewer out of a 55-gallon barrel, if they just email me or call me, I'm happy to do that for them.
What's your email then?
chillinirvanos382@gmail.com.
All right. Well, we had a question about foliar applications of compost tea. Essentially the question was about the benefits of it. You also had me thinking about this question when you were talking about insects that kind of are attacking your plant. And I feel like I've heard people say that foliar applications of compost tea somehow hurts the bad insects. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that because I'd say bullshit to what you just said. One of my best friends is James Nardi. He's a research biologist, entomologist, artist, writer at the University of Indiana. And a lot of people, all of us know people think they know everything. Well, I like to talk about Nardi as Nardi does. Nardi does know everything. So he does all this incredible microscopy, and they've thought for the last few years, Oregon State even theoretically said, yeah, that there's Bavaria bassiani and another fungus-eating insect that are in plants. They don't know how it got there, but they said it's there. Well, through Jim in Nardi's new book, he talked about it, because I didn't even tell people this for a long time, because the way people seal stuff in the scientific community, but it's published now. And so it goes in through the stomata. And so this Bavaria bassiani, which is I don't know if you know what it is, but it's an incredible fungus-eating fungus bacteria, fungus-eating fungus, and I've got lots of it in my bins. But when this Bavaria, it was first discovered by Bossi in Italy at the same time Louis Pasteur, and Louis Pasteur got all the credit for saving the silkworm industry, but really it was Bossi. And what Bossi found was if this insect-eating bacteria, if they could stop it, because it was eating all the silkworms, and so they so by getting by stopping this fungus, they could save they saved the silkworm industry. But on the other hand, it's a great predator because it eats insects, and like I'll find it in my bins, and there'll be like a beetle, even a valuable beetle. It's encrusted with this white mold, and it just takes a couple drops of this mold from the Bavaria bassiani to get on it. That it starts shooting all these rods through the insect, and so it's great for pest control because you can put it in your application tank and spray it out. And then at the end of the application, there'll still be some floating, a colony be floating on top of your tank, and then you take it back home, and it just stays there. And these insects, like these argentid beetles and these other beetles, they'll escape it if you put a whole pumpkin or a whole squash. I found them inside those. They got inside those pumpkins somehow to avoid the Bavaria.
So with the Bavaria and it attacking like these bugs, what about like the moths and the little larvae that burrow into our flowers and rot our flowers from within?
Well, that could happen. I don't know. I don't have that problem because everybody's down on yellow jackets, but yellow jackets eat so many larvae. And so if you're outdoor grow, the yellow jackets are going to take care of a lot of the bud problems inside. If you get them inside, I don't know, JR.
Yeah, well, I grow outside, and I have tons of issues with caterpillars. This month especially, and there's a beehive in my neighbor's yard next door. So I know that as much as those predatory insects help, I still have issues with moths and caterpillars. So
you still have to be out there every day.
Yeah.
Being a predator yourself. You know?
So I was kind of confused earlier when you were saying you called bullshit on the ability to use Compost Tea as a foliar spray, but then you kind of described using Compost Tea as a foliar spray.
Exactly. Well, the reason the foliar spray works is they used to teach the reason foliar sprays worked is you put all these creatures on top of the leaves, and so then the bad people couldn't inhabit the leaf surface.
Right.
But in reality, your foliar spray, you're spraying it on the leaves, and the plant's taking it into the stomata, and so you're getting all this protection from inside the plant.
Okay.
The Bavaria and things like that are going inside the plant.
Through the plant. Okay.
Right, through the stomata.
Yeah.
And so that's why foliar sprays are so valuable.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess before we go and get to our last like few questions that JR has for you in our kind of wrap up sesh, um, how do I kind of culture this Bravaria or whatever it is fungus? How do I make that happen? Because it sounds very tempting. I want it. So how do I get it?
Well, one thing, if you get ecosystem compost from me, inoculant, it'll probably have it in it. But you can also buy it from insectaries. They sell it. And see, that was always the problem, is there was never an effective way of applying it. And so one of the biggest successes I've ever had is I was in the wine industry for a long time, and phylloxera, which is a root louse, wiped out the wine industry in Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so there was only like 3 countries that it didn't affect, Portugal and anyway, so California planted on the wrong rootstock that the French had never planted XR7. They did. And so California has been totally replanted. And it was slower to get to Oregon because we grow more like Burgundy and our vineyards are more spaced. And so Bethel Heights, one of the brilliant people in all just in the wine industry, friend of mine, Mimi Castile, we got introduced to my system in 2011, and they're a flat block that they were getting $65 a bottle for their Pinot. Flat block was going downhill. And so Mimi took over the vineyard, and in 2011, and it stopped. It neutralized. It didn't get any worse, and by 2013, they were back up to 13 barrels, and a barrel's like 260 cases, I believe. And we'd never heard in the wine industry, we'd never heard of phylloxera being reversed. And, it's, one of those things, there's no science, there hasn't been big experiments with it, but it happened.
That's amazing. And so I want to kind of go back to some of the soil stuff that we had talked about earlier. So one thing that I'm very interested in and have been in a long time, and it's something that plagues the wine industry, is powdery mildew. Powdery mildew, from what I'm understanding, has a life cycle in the soil. In the wet season, from my understanding, it kind of populates. And then in the dry season, it kind of sporulates and gets everywhere. But what I've also heard is that the natural predators to the PM fungus in the soil are nematodes and bacillus bacteria. Do you have any knowledge about that at all?
All I can say, excuse the language, but powdery mildew is a bastard. For centuries, it's been a bastard in the wine industry. And I've talked to some of the major, I talked to Robert Drouin one day. I was telling about, well, they say that, if you inoculate with compost tea, you can stop powdery mildew in its tracks. He laughed at me.
Yeah, I would too. No offense.
And it's still to this day, I mean, what I've done about powdery mildew is I try to have target plants, like, in October or September, when things start, getting into that season. I like to have zucchini or something growing that it's going to attack that plant first. And because I've been really lucky, I haven't had that or bud mold in my grow for years. I try to, do resistant plants that are somewhat resistant to it, and I harvest the second I see it.
So when you're in flower, are you foliar spraying on a regular basis to help fight bad bugs or anything like that?
No, no, I'm not even, I don't, with 2 weeks, with 2 weeks to go, like I gave him compost tea the other day, and I'm about 2 weeks into flower, and I might do it one more time.
Interesting. Because, yeah, when I start running into issues with the caterpillars, which I'm in the thick of right now, because we've had this weird summer on the West Coast. And so a few of my plants started flowering like kind of around the beginning of July. So I have a couple plants that are like very well into flower that I can harvest relatively soon. And that's what the caterpillars are just attacking the shit out of these plants right now, and it's pretty frustrating. So the allure of the compost tea is interesting to me, but at that what I'm talking about is probably like 5-6 weeks into flower, but at that point you're no longer foliar spraying. Do you feel like the benefits of these microbes and fungi and things like that are coming from the compost tea and in through the roots, and then benefiting you're benefiting that way too, maybe?
No, indeed, indeed. Have you? I don't know how big your plants are, how many plants you have, but have you tried covering them with with remay or anything?
Yeah, eventually I'll have to. I think that's kind of the next steps, probably. Yeah. Well, JR, we gotta run. It's been really good hanging out with you today, Mark. This has been a really good interview. And I know we had multiple people in the chat saying that they were enjoying all the compost chat today. So, let's see. One last question for you, or a last couple questions for you, but one of the ones that we love to kind of wrap up with is your um, big aha moment in the cannabis industry, or one other way we've described it is your like oh shit moment, or just maybe when the light bulb went off. Is there a moment like that for you in the cannabis industry?
Well, the greatest thing in the cannabis industry for me is, I've been in this. I'm a farm kid. I've been farming all my life, and but the biggest thing for me is I've been you know, I've been in the agriculture, eco ag business for, active for 25 years. And so I've been dealing with all these people. And from the side I was on, these people are more forward thinking than most farmers. But the thing that I'm most excited about is what's blown me away is the homegrown cannabis people are way more advanced than any other farmers in the United States. That
Yeah,
that's
shout
what
out.
that's what excites me and why I want to help all I can.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting. I think it has to have probably something to do with it being such a high dollar crop that it could, at least for, the first last several years of when legalization was kind of kicking off, we saw so much room for people to do scientific studies, and it just seems like we know so much. I don't know. It just seems like a lot of the innovation has been coming from cannabis recently, and it's been bleeding out into other parts too. But also, shout outs to the other part of agriculture too, because I feel like a lot of us in cannabis have so much to learn from traditional agriculture as well.
No, that's true, but um, and I think there's been a big flip about the people that are growing today. When 15 years ago, when a cannabis grower would call me, I'd know exactly who it was because he was so arrogant. He wasn't a rancher, he wasn't a farmer, and I didn't want to deal with him. He said, "I'll take every speck of compost you have." I go, "No, no, there's a lot of people in front of you." But it's exactly the opposite now. I mean, along with the cartels are still making shit, and
Yeah.
everybody, a lot of the commercial people, they don't care. They're putting a bunch of crap on their plants. But basically, a friend of mine that was at the Cup last year. He's a consultant, a big consultant in the Midwest, and he said that a cannabis home grower should be the farm manager on every farm in America.
Well, Mark, I wanted to give you a little shout out. Got a little book in the mail. I want to shout out, and if you could maybe talk about some of the stuff you've authored and some of the books that are out there that people could find and enjoy.
Well, yeah, like I said, I've written a lot over the years for Acres USA, which used to be the the cutting edge of eco agriculture. Chuck Walters started the magazine in 1970, and he'll go down as one of the icons of agriculture, along with Sir Albert and Vandana Shiva and stuff like that. But after Chuck died in 2011, his son took it over, and he was still pretty good. But then they sold the magazine in 2011, and they lost their vision. And so that's what the DGC has done for me, is given me a new place to put my passion. And so I've written a lot through the years on health, and on healthy soil has been the main thing. I've written on food, on grass-fed beef, that I guess if you look up in Acres, you can find that. That cover of of my book there was taken in Chablis, France, in Drouin's vineyard, and in that year, it was the worst mold I'd ever seen in anywhere, in any of the vineyards I'd been in. I was in the wine industry a long time, and we were going through these vineyards in Chablis, and just row after row of just mold and mold. I mean, it was disgusting. And all of a sudden, you came to Drouin's, and it looked like a county park, all these vineyards, until you came to Drouin's vineyards, and they'd been biodynamic since 98. And there's cover crops up to your knees, and these beetles were flying around everywhere, and there wasn't a speck of mold anywhere in that vineyard. And that was one of those aha moments that you were asking about, Sam. I mean, that just blew me away.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much knowledge today. Can you give us a couple book titles that people could look up on Amazon or whatever? Where can they find your stuff, basically?
Well, basically, they can just email me to get my book, and then that's the best way. And then the other thing is, it's really important to get a great knowledge of soil to go to Amazon or look up James Nardi and get any of his books. They're brilliant. Mouse's Backyard, and he's another writer that writes very simply so that everybody can understand. And that's the way I write too, so that I just make it simple so that I can understand it. My degrees are in literature and creative writing. Definitely not science, but I've been pretty much accepted by the scientific community as a scientist.
It's kind of I imagine it's kind of a dueling passions that have kind of worked out for you over the years. Can you talk about maybe one last thing, how cannabis has played a role in your creativity and in your writing process?
Well, yeah, it's lately, especially, I've been writing a lot the last year and a half, and a lot of the I'm a visual naturalist poet, and so I write about life in the woods around me, and So Jack Herrera is just a great strain that every time I smoke it, there's another poem happening. I don't know if that answers the question, but and just the fellowship that I've gotten. There's like five people on our gravel road that grow now, because I give them plants.
That's good, Mark. We appreciate that. That's what we call growers love. That's what we call growers love. Well, thank you again so much for all your time, and thank you for your willingness to share the knowledge that's going to help our community grow. And as you know, our plant is under siege by corporate America. We want to try to give the plant back to the people and the knowledge on how to grow it. And so we really, really thank you for your time and your contribution to our community.
Well, I'm serious about it. People want to email me, I'll call them back if they email me with their phone number, because I'm definitely into helping people build great soil and grow great weed.
So again, one more time, what's that email? Yeah,
yes.
What's the email?
C is in champion, H is in hotel, I is in indigo, L is in Larry, I is in indigo, N is in Nancy, E is in elephant, R is in Roger, V is in Victor, A is in Alpha, N is in Nancy, O is in Oscar, S is in Sam, 382 at gmail.com.
There it is.
There you go.
There it is.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Mark. It's been great hanging out with you this afternoon. If you guys have enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe to the channel. We've got more coming your way just after this interview. In the next episode, we're going to be talking to Colin Bell all about bricks and all kinds of things, getting into more science and things, growing questions. So make sure to subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one. But as always, growers love.